Folks, so can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So what we will do today is we had a quick look at the economics of Adam Smith in the class, previous class, plus some additional biographical details. But I think Adam Smith as a thinker, as an economist, and also as a thinker about larger capitalist society, is far more important than just his core of his economics. Adam Smith was trying to solve a very, very interesting problem. The problem was that he was trying to solve was, look, if you have a society which is primarily driven by self-interested men and women, so selfish men and women, self-interest which drives everybody's actions. Okay, so it's all fine to say that if you know uh, it is essentially people's self-interest which makes the economy possible. But then how do you ensure that this society, where everybody is greedy, selfish, does not end up in a war of all against all? How do you make sure that does not end up as a rentier society? How do you ensure that this is not a Hobbesian, war of all against all? So I think that is the problem which Smith was really trying to solve, and so that problem I think is also very important today. Smith essentially talked about institutions. Institutions of certain kinds were important, and he also talked about how to design institutions which would then ensure that we have a decent society, and sits with a certain meaning of what a decent society means. So I think these are very critical questions right now, because right now I think our whole idea of economic reform is essentially about freedom, about liberty, about reducing barriers to trade, reducing barriers to entry, increasing competition. So basically, we are doing everything which would kind of boost the selfish desires of men and women, in the hope that the invisible hand would work out and we would actually have a society which is beneficial to everybody. But I think we are leaving many gaps unfilled. So it is important, and Smith was actually tackling those issues. Okay, so it would be important to actually take a detailed look at what Smith was doing. So 2 or 3 lectures next, we'll spend on really understanding the basis of Adam Smith's ideas on the economy and what kind of policy flows from that. Yeah, and I've also sent you a PowerPoint presentation. So what I really do now is to take you through that presentation. Look, this is really a crucial problem now. Okay, we are seeing all kinds of things unfolding around us. We are seeing the whole thing where the entire credibility of the government and the administration, the police is in question. And why? Because we are seeing essentially people acting on the basis of greed, right? Okay, so so Smith actually has questions for this and has answers for this, right? So unbridled capitalism can be a very dangerous system, and I'll take you through I made a presentation for that, so I'll take you through. I'm sharing now my screen now. So can you all see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
And you can see a title called Adam Smith for Our Times.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So of course all of you know that Smith is probably the single most important progenitor for ideas about the economy. It was not that Smith was the first one to understand that there was a connection between private motives, private selfishness, and the larger economy. There are people who said that earlier. Okay, for example, Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, okay, which is called private vice and public virtue. Yeah, so essentially the role of self-interest in running the economy was already there. But what Smith did was, in one tour de force, in one large book, synthesized a lot of these ideas and put them together as a method of thinking. Okay, so there is very little that is actually original in Smith as ideas are concerned. Smith was not a very original person, a very systematic person. So he put everything together, okay, and actually created a method of thinking about the economy. That's why Smith, we need to study Smith. Yeah, and probably the method of thinking about the economy that he created uh, still continues to form a very major portion of the way we think about the economy. But the Smith we know is different from the Smith that actually exists. For example, Smith has been appropriated. You know, so we are now, when we look at microeconomics today, we think of individual action as utility maximizing individuals, private selfish individuals, and we think that this method of maximizing utility, solving, trying to understand people's actions as if they were maximizing utility with respect to constraints, is the basic mode of understanding human action. And we also carry it over to a lot of other disciplines. For example, work by Gary Baker carried economics to economics of marriages. Or, there's a whole host of fields that economists have colonized. Particularly economists who come from the Chicago tradition have actually sort of used Adam Smith in a certain way. I think that is not the right Adam Smith. Okay, the right Adam Smith is probably the Kirkcaldy Adam Smith. Okay, the man who was writing in Kirkcaldy, and we all of us know a little bit about, will get to know more. Smith's project of a liberal society. How do you actually, what he called the problem of cohesion? Okay, so how do you actually have a society which is based on, which is freedom, which is driven by private interests, but which still yields public good, which does not get driven into a war of all against all, okay, of greedy cutthroat competition. So that is the project which Smith had, and I think that project is very relevant today. Okay, another important thing that I would like to talk to you about, and we'll keep on talking about, is that many things that we think of as technical, many ideas that we think of as technical, as purely belonging to the realm of economics, actually arise in certain specific social, cultural, political context, religious contexts. For example, we understand a lot of Smith's ideas actually come from Christian theology. Yeah, and the various challenges to the Christian theology. So you can't really root the whole. For example, the idea of invisible hand. Okay, I'll see that it can actually be rooted in certain Christian traditions. So our ideas many times come from certain genesis, and it's important. It is not that they are less useful or less valid because they have a origin in a particular social, cultural, or political or religious context. Uh, so but it's important to know that context. Yeah, for example, when later on we'll talk about macroeconomics, we'll understand that a lot of things which you see as graphs in your books, like say Downbush and Fisher, actually have their genesis in some political debates in the developed world. Okay, there are certain political contexts within which certain policy debates arise, and then there is some intelligent person who puts that into maths or puts that into a graph, and then the graph becomes a textbook, and the textbook is taught to you. Right. So I think it's always important to know the genesis of the ideas which we study. Yeah, so that's also another thing I have to do with this lecture. So now this lecture is going to be divided into three parts. One was, what was Smith trying to do? What was Smith's project per se? Okay, what was Smith engaged with? That will be what we'll do in this particular lecture. Then in the next classes we'll see the intellectual cultural context of Smith's ideas. So where did Smith get these ideas from? Who were the progenitors? Who contributed to this? What were the philosophical traditions which generated these ideas? And we'll see how the Chicago tradition appropriated Smith to themselves. But there's also another strand which flows from Smith, which is the Sen and Buchanan kind of approach of public good, which we'll also come to later. And finally, we'll look at Smith's economics in detail and see what kind of contemporary challenges it helps to solve. Now, please remember, Smith wrote 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, almost 250 years ago. Correct? Now, obviously, solutions which came 250 years ago are not going to be directly useful to us as they are. But his method of thinking, his way of understanding the functioning of a capitalist economy is going to be quite important for us, quite insightful. So As I said, Smith is the founder and systematizer of capitalist economics. Because even when there were people who were writing about private enterprise, private interests, private selfishness, and markets and their importance and so on, Smith was the first person to put that into systematic treatise, and therefore the founder and the systematizer of capitalist economics. Now, many people invoke Smith, and Smith is invoked by those who feel that public good automatically springs out of the pursuit of self-interest. So if you let all people be, do whatever they want to, then the maximum good of the maximum people will come about, right? And they naturally regard governments as enemies of liberty because they try to prevent people from doing what they want to do. And they cite Smith's natural liberty as a defense for legalizing everything. So legalizing everything from drugs to pornography is, Smith is used to cite for that, right? And I can give you references. So dominant image of Smith is an advocate of unhampered self-interest, an opponent of government, and an icon of individualism. It's important to remember that many people who style their arguments as medians are actually substituting their own views for what Smith actually said, because Smith didn't really say any of these things. And so Smith was not really individualistic, but as we'll see, Smith very strongly believed that societal influence transforms people into moral beings. Moral people was a very important concern for Smith. And Smith never used the word laissez-faire. Laissez-faire doesn't come from Smith. It comes from the physiocratic tradition in France. Okay, so laissez-faire is not a word in Smith. Okay, even the invisible hand, he has only used thrice. One in a book which he called History of Astronomy. So Smith actually wrote a book called The History of Astronomy, in which he used the word invisible hand once. Then in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he used the idea invisible hand once. And in the Wealth of Nations, he used the idea once. And it has certain specific connotations about the scientific method, rather than, and Smith's beliefs about the world and the deity and all that. But it doesn't really, so we, I think, very often associate the word invisible hand with Smith and only Smith. But Smith's book is not full of the idea. Right? So Smith actually argued that people often misjudge their self-interest. Right? Smith also thought that the attempt to explain all human behavior on the basis of self-interest was not only analytically misguided, but also morally pernicious. Okay, so Smith was not really an advocate of us explaining all human behavior on the basis of self-interest. So in Smith's ideal society, men and women will be free to pursue their self-interests. They will liberty. But that could only be made possible by the growth of government and fostering institutions that promoted self-control. So for Smith, freedom to pursue their self-interest is not unbridled liberty. Right? It is the freedom to pursue self-interest which is made possible by the government and growth of institutions which also foster self-control. Yeah, so this is an important dimension of Smith, which is generally not argued. So Smith's liberty was not liberty from all control, as felt, but it was a freedom to control one's passions. And how do you learn this freedom? This freedom was to be learned from social institutions, including the market, but extending to family, law, religious communities, etc. The whole set of institutions which actually created an environment which made liberty possible. Okay. So basically, Smith's natural liberty is not liberty to do as one pleases. It's not a lack of any institutional restraint. So Marxism might be ready for interment. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that Marxism is dead. And as an analytical tradition, probably it's dead. But I'm going to soon take a lecture on talking about why it's important to read Marx even now. Okay, because the answers might not be valid, but the questions are definitely valid. So Marxism might be ready for internment. So let's take as a qualified statement. But as you know, contemporary capitalism and conservatism are hardly in better health today. Right? We really don't think that the capitalist economy is doing all very well. Right? So why do you think that? So basically liberals, and these should actually bring you to debates in India. So liberals tend to promote rights and entitlements. Okay, and we need to distinguish between forms of conduct that are worthy of government support and that are not. Okay, so not all forms of conduct should be supported by the government. Some forms of conduct should actually be discouraged by the government. But the whole discourse upon rights and entitlements, the whole liberal discourse today actually diagnosis does not pay enough attention to that. So conservatives ask naturally, how can the government promote common good if then politics is little more than the struggle among competing groups for entitlements? If citizens can make claims on the state, but the state cannot make any on the individuals, and the institutions fostering self-control are beyond the state's reach, then should we be surprised at emergence of men and women less able and even more less willing to limit their desires? So basically, if you really don't have, so basically, if citizens can make claims on the state, there are rights, but there are no responsibilities, there are no duties. Okay, and there is there's perfect liberty in the sense everybody can do as he or she pleases, and the whole thing is driven by self-interest. So how do you deal with situations? You will have men and women who are pursuing their self-interest and who are not willing and not even able to limit their desires. Okay. Now the inability of the people to limit their desires makes them dangerous to others. Now, is it surprising that individuals look to the state primarily as an institution that protects them from their fellow citizens? So is that what the state is supposed to be? Right, so you have all these selfish individuals following their pursuits without any self-restraint. Naturally, they are enemies of each other because, and then the state's role is only to protect citizens from each other. Is that the kind of role of the state? And this is what conservatives naturally ask of the discourse, liberal discourse, which essentially only talks about rights of individuals and liberty in the sense of allowing of people of arguing for letting people do as they please. So unbridled self-interest, right? So these are the questions that arise. On the other hand, conservatives want to conserve traditional cultural and social institutions. Okay. Now, when liberals urge the enlargement of rights, conservatives cite the importance of responsibilities. Liberals warn that the state is interfering with inalienable right to experiment with lifestyles, and this would ring a bell to you in the Indian context. Conservatives warn of the danger of failed experiments and the need to protect institutions that have stood the test of time. Yes, it's that kind of a debate that we are really. So neither the liberals nor the so conservatives regard free markets among the tried and true institutions they seek to conserve. But what happens when the market, driven by profit motives, elevates desire above duty, and when the fastest way to make a quick buck is in fact what the conservatives regard as the lowliest of all desires? Might not the market erode the very basis of the traditional institutions that the conservatives seek to conserve? So that's another question. Now, some conservatives decided that the government is the enemy. And because government is the enemy, they devote no time to designing any policy for the government. And in fact, work actively to reduce the role of the government. But is the best antidote to bad policy having no policy at all? Yeah, so these are the kind of questions so no wonder, thoughtful liberals and conservatives are seeking answers. Both conservative traditions and liberal traditions are, at least the thoughtful among them are at the crossroads. And, academics don't seem to be helping. So academics sometimes either provide completely unworldly answers or irrelevant answers to the questions, or sometimes act merely as cheerleaders for their favorite intellectual position. So you actually have economics of pro-Modi and anti, that kind of thing. Right? So it doesn't really help answering the most important questions that society faces today. Yeah. So Smith is important because Smith addressed many of these questions. Okay. Again, as I said, the answers that Smith gave will not be the ones which we can use right today after 2.5 centuries. But the method of thinking, the way Smith went about thinking, about thinking about these problems, is going to be a very insightful thing, and we're going to actually learn a lot about how to the issue that society faces today. Right. So, what is the question that Smith tried to understand? He tried to understand the origins and institutional prerequisites of a commercial society. So, how does a commercial society come into being? And what institutions are necessary to bring a commercial society into being? And once it has been brought into being, what institutions would best preserve commercial society? Yes, that was the question that Smith tried to answer. Then Smith also looked at the social, political, cultural, and military effects of a commercial society. Okay? Smith, in particular, eliminates the relationship between economic, military, religious, and cultural institutions. So all the institutions are interdependent, and Smith actually brings out the interdependence of economic, military, religious, and cultural institutions. Smith is a great balancer. So Smith provides an antidote to the view that the sole role of the market and the government is to make people richer, right? And that any attempt to make society more moral will necessarily backfire. Yeah, so I think this is a very important point. Right? Smith provides an antidote to the view that the sole role of markets and government is to make people richer, let them allow them to sort of improve their material prospects. And if you try to make society more moral, it'll backfire. Smith actually challenged this and argued against this. Smith provides a corrective to those who believe that government is the enemy, and also to those who think that the markets are who think of markets as wasteful and immoral. So again, you see Smith as balancing the arguments correctly. Right? So he sees a role for the government. He also sees a role for the markets. He also sees government as good as well as bad. He sees markets as good as well as bad. Smith balances both. Okay, those who believe that self-interest is the last word, and those who think that self-interest is entirely immoral. Okay. And Smith also acts as a corrective to those who disdain politics for his emphasis on the welfare of the general population. That we'll call elitism. Right? And Smith also corrects those who think that a modern polity can actually survive without elites. So elites have to be there. You have to preserve the interests of elites, but you also have to look after the general population in society. And Smith actually creates it as a balancing kind of an act. So Smith is really a great balancer in that. As Smith provides a way of looking at the social world that balances a moral concern with a realistic appraisal of human nature and human institutions. Okay. Right. Now, so Smith, what is the proper role for a social scientist? The proper role for a social scientist, then, to Smith, is to identify institutional means by which the various human passions can be harnessed to pursue a more decent society. I'm going to come to all these words. Okay, what do you mean by decent society? What are the human passions and so on? Right. So basically, Smith is looking for what kind of institutional structure should you have, so that people with all their frivolities and selfishness and all that can actually, you can have a society which actually is a more decent society. So basically, Smith feels then exclusive focus on the rights without think of institutions which make rights possible and which in fact give meaning to rights is problematic. Right, so it's essentially critical focus of Smith is then on making the right institutions possible. Right, so how does he go about that? Right, so Smith first sets up a model of conduct that ought to be encouraged. Right, so he first lays down what is it that's good. Right, what kind of a model of conduct should be encouraged, and then he tries to see. Then he says whether the existing institutions that you have can actually promote such behavior. And then he also suggests ways to reform those institutions if they cannot promote behavior that ought to be encouraged, or if they can, then he discusses methods of preserving those institutions. Okay. Now, there's a question here. What do you think by moral conduct? Obviously, it's a debatable question, and many of you would argue that in a pluralistic society, we've always had people talking about, but morality can be subjective. Okay, what is good, what is bad is subjective. But look here, obviously, right? While granting that in a pluralistic society there cannot be any consensus on what is a virtuous existence, right? Okay, especially in a society which is highly pluralistic, what one set of people thinks is good might not be what other set of people think. Question that Smith asks is, can societies survive in the long term without having a minimal such understanding of what is good and what is bad for society? Can societies go on and on, survive for a long time in the long term without at least across different belief systems achieving at least a minimal consensus of what is good society, what is good, right? Can we have standards of conduct that are necessary if societies are to thrive? So that's the important question that Smith is asking. Can we have standards of conduct that are necessary if societies are to thrive? And if once we have the standards of conduct, then what kind of institutional structures would actually promote or hamper them? Right. So according to Smith, Smith believed that institutions that fostered prudence, self-control, respect for lives and property, among some, at least among some members of the society, a concern for the public good, so public spiritedness, ability to recognize the likely outcomes of one's actions, and an awareness of the limits of what is knowable and foreseeable were all relevant for the second question, that is, can we have standards of conduct that are necessary if societies are to thrive? Right. So these things: prudence, self-control, respect for lives and property, like at least some people being public spirited, ability to recognize the likely outcomes of one's actions, and awareness of the limits of what is knowable and foreseeable were all together necessary for actually creating a societies which would be decent societies in the long. Okay. So Smith's classic plan is the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice, towards which society is to evolve. Okay, society will not be there, but they can evolve. Right. So what, according to Smith, was a good society? Right. What, according to Smith, was a decent society? Right. An ideal society, remember, is one in which the working, to Smith, is one in which the working class are tolerably well-fed, clothed, and lodged. Right. So Smith was judging the progress of societies not by its growth rate or anything of that kind. He was judging it by the welfare of the poorest in the society. Right. And Smith, according to Smith, an ideal society is a society, right? Ideal society where working classes are tolerably, so basically the poorest of the poor are tolerably well-fed, clothed, and lodged. So basically, basic necessities of the poorest are satisfied in a reasonable way, to a decent, in a tolerable manner. Okay. So I'm taking a quoting from the Wealth of Nations. Okay. Servants, laborers, and workmen of different kinds make up the greater part of every capitalist society. But what improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconveniency to the whole. No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity, besides. So equity is important for Smith. It is but equity, besides, that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well-fed, clothed, and lodged. This is the Wealth of Nations. So this, to Smith, is an ideal society. Okay, so ideal society is a society where the poorest are decently well-clothed, well-dressed, well-fed, and lodged, basic decent standards of living, and where essentially he thinks of it not only as a matter of, he thinks of it as a matter of equity. Right, so to Smith, equity is also important. Yeah, because he says that, but equity, right? Besides, right? So those who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole country should themselves have decent clothing, decent lodging, and decent, should be reasonably well fed. And so equity is important to Smith. This is a very different picture from the Smith that we are told of, right? So we look at free market economies. If you look at a modern neoclassical economics, he would say that inequality doesn't really matter. Yeah. Okay. What matters is growth, and growth at the top of the pyramid. Okay. And there is all lip service to growth trickling down, right? Trickling down and raising the welfare of. So everybody, whenever you ask anybody why do you want fast growth, they would say because it reduces poverty. But it doesn't. We don't have evidence for growth reducing poverty necessarily. Okay, right? The evidence in India is also highly questionable and has been debated on, as we'll see soon. Right? So then is growth necessarily a good strategy to Adam Smith, and growth necessarily, and why do you have economic reforms? Why do you have liberalization, privatization? It is because we say that that leads to faster growth because that leads to faster efficiency. But if that whole process is not going to generate, not going to lead to where the working classes or the poorest in society are tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged, then that's not, that I don't think would be the ideal kind of a growth pattern for Smith. Yeah. So the liberal plan. So what is the liberal plan? I'm quickly coming to it. To Smith, the liberal plan is the best constitution for the working class. Why? Because it produces the greatest wealth for the nation and distributes it justly. So again, distribution is important for Smith. This is because the liberal plan, okay, the freedom and security it offers to each individual, which in turn encourages the most productive use of resources. So as every resource holder allocates his labor and stock to the most advantageous option, all are engaged in competition for opportunities that eliminates advantages and requires efficiency for survival. So this is a very important statement, what we're going to read now. So basically in Smith's liberal plan, men and women will be free to supply the labor to whichever occupation they want to. Right? Why? Is it important just for the freedom? No. The whole of that, so I'm again reading Smith and this again from the Wealth of Nations. The whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock is capital. The whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock must, in the same neighborhood, be either perfectly equal or continually tending to equality. Wage rates and profit rates must continuously go towards equality. If in the same neighborhood there was any employment evidently either more or less advantageous than the rest, right? So where the wage rates were higher, so many people would crowd into in the one case, and so many would desert it in the other. So wage rates were higher than the surrounding ones, everybody would come there. Wage rates were lower than the surrounding ones, everybody would desert it. That its advantages would soon return to the level of other employments. Right? So there are so many people coming into an employment with high wage rates would fall. People leaving employments with low wage rates would rise. So it would mean that wage rates would tend to be equalized. Similarly for capital. That at least would be the case in a society where things were left to follow their natural course, where there was perfect liberty, and where every man was, Smith says man, but it's man, woman as well, that where every man was perfectly free both to choose what occupation he thought proper and to change it as often as he thought proper. Every man's interest would prompt him to seek the advantageous and to shun the disadvantageous employment. And I must remember that the economy that England that Smith was writing about was coming out of a very feudal kind of a structure where there were lords and there were serfs, and people had to work forcefully for the lords, and the economy was slowly evolving into more commercial kind of an economy where there were guilds, for example. So workers were, they're members of guilds for craftsmen, and other people could not. Suppose there was a guild for stonemasons, and anybody who was not a stonemason could not take up the job of a stonemason because the guild would oppose that. Guilds monopolized occupations, right? So it is on that background that Smith is now making this argument. But more generally, for Smith now, independence is the key, okay, to personal dignity and maturity. It is independence which allows people to go from one occupation where you're not paid well to another occupation where you're paid better. And competition among free individuals generates a distribution that allows workers to be tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. Okay. Right? So essentially, its independence is the key to personal dignity and maturity. Now, as Smith shows, capital as it circulates in the world of perfect liberty comes back more enhanced after every circuit. So you got more capital, every capital expands, right? Because capital expands, increases the demand for labor, which then raises wages, which then squeezes profits. And this continues till profits fall so low that they just cover the cost of management. So what will happen to Smith under the liberal plan is the least among the working class will do tolerably well and inequality will diminish. Right? That is the liberal plan which Smith has in mind. So what are the constituents of a liberal plan? Competition, free competition among men and women for economic opportunities. Right? So if there is free competition of men and women among economic opportunities. If wages are high, for example, in one place compared to another, then everybody will go to the high wages. People, and the wages will fall. So basically, which will mean that wages are similar everywhere. Profits are not too high, right? So everybody's inequality is not very high, and everybody is fed, clothed, and lodged tolerably well. Okay, so that is the Smithian idea. So that is how Smith tries to connect the free market enterprise to his conception of ideal society. But remember, this requires freedom for every individual to move from one occupation to another. It requires freedom from capital to flow across occupations, across employments. Right? Assumes that there are no inequalities, inherent inequalities among people, right, which prevents some from doing something else. Right? So these are the kind of so especially in that kind of society, obviously, which most societies are. This liberal plan itself, does not apply directly, right? So what Smith values most, of course, is though he calls it a liberal plan, values most is not the liberty. Liberty is, for example, to choose the highest paying occupation not by itself valuable. It's an instrument. It's an instrument for doing what? Instrument for providing to all citizens an equal opportunity to have a life of secure tranquility. So, what is it that Smith wants people to have? Why does Smith want people to be fed, reasonably well fed, reasonably well lodged, etc.? His essential idea is that people should be able to enjoy a life of secure tranquility. Tranquility is peace of mind. Happy temper. Give this TMS. That equal and happy temper, which is so necessary to self-satisfaction and enjoyment. Right? That's which calls the peace of mind. So this is very important statement again from the theory of moral sentiments. In the most glittering and exalted situations that our idle fancy can hold out to us, from which we propose to derive a real happiness, are almost the same with those which, in our actual the humble positions, we have at all times at hand and in our power. Let's again read this. In the most glittering and exalted situations that our idle fancy can hold out to us, the pleasure from which we propose to derive a real happiness are almost the same with those which, in our actual though humble station, we have at all times at hand and in our power. Except the frivolous pleasures of vanity and superiority, we may find in the most humble station, where there is only personal liberty, every other which the most exalted can afford, and the pleasures of vanity and superiority are seldom consistent with perfect tranquility, the principle and foundation of all real and satisfactory employment. Right. So basically, Smith's objective is to have tranquility, the peace of mind, right? Peace of mind, as it defines it here, that equal and happy temper, which is so necessary to self-satisfaction and enjoyment. So self-satisfaction, self-fulfillment, and enjoyment is what to Smith are ultimately the objectives of human existence, and any arrangement which promotes this is to him an ideal arrangement, and he feels that his idea of a liberal plan is what will achieve this in the most efficient way. But of course, the liberal plan is aware they will fully achieved. but can be approximated evolutionarily. So the economy can evolve towards the liberal plan, right? And can get fairly close to the liberal plan. Now, the Smith's project was the following then, because we started with the question of what was Smith's project. To lay down his vision of the ideal, right? So he has laid down his vision of the ideal, right? And which we saw, where the working class is tolerably well clothed, fed, and lodged, and then his next step is to persuade his readers that this is an ideal that humankind can indeed approximate, right? So therefore, Smith's book was a book of great hope. Okay, he actually argued that we can actually approximate this ideal, and that his moral philosophical system, the liberal plan, right, it represents the contours of the ideal. So it represents more or less what the ideal is, and also highlights the obstacles that impede progress towards the ideal. Okay, that his system is therefore an instructive, worthwhile guide for public policy aimed at pursuing this idea. Right. So to and yes, should you be interested in this? These are the two references which you already have. Adam Smith's moral Iwensky Jerry, Adam Smith's moral philosophy, a historical contempt perspective, markets, law, ethics, and culture, and Jerry Muller, Adam Smith in his time and ours, designing the decent society. Right. So basically, Adam Smith's challenge was how does one design a decent society? Right, and I think that challenge all of us are grappling with right at this moment. How do you actually have a decent society where people are happy, right? Okay, and so that's why Adam Smith is very, very important to us as of now. Okay, and so so roughly, what is a decent society of Adam Smith? Decent society of Adam Smith is not where there will be lots of goods and services, not where per capita income is essentially very high, because you can go to this and then look at this last paragraph, right? Okay, so Smith has a very clear idea of what it is, right? Okay, the most glittering and exalted situation that our idle fancy can hold out to us, the pleasures from which we propose to derive real happiness, almost the same with those which, in our actual to humble station, we have at all times at hand and in our powers. It's not really a lot of goods and service, not really high per capita income, right? It is basically personal liberty, and personal liberty giving us into a society, a life which is a life of perfect tranquility. Okay, which is the principle and foundation of all real and satisfactory enjoyment. So basically perfect tranquility is what is critical to Smith, and perfect tranquility for everybody in this society, not only for him. How does one achieve that? That can be achieved by liberty. So liberty is an instrument. What does liberty would mean that if there are occupations where wages are high, if people have so liberty to choose whatever occupation one wants to do, liberty to deploy one's capital wherever one wants to, would actually ensure, right, that wages everywhere are equalized and are of a decent value. Where the rate of return, so there is not big difference between and workers, working class and the capital class in society. And it's that kind of society that Smith is aspiring to. And he thinks that if people are allowed to follow their self-interest, that kind of society would emerge. By liberty, really. We need to understand ideas of self-interest and self-love and all those ideas more critically in Smith, and we'll go on as we go on, we'll understand that. Right. So the liberal plan is for okay. The whole idea that taught to us, right? For example, many economists will tell you that Smith was essentially interested in pursuit of self-interest, and they'll quote those lines by Smith, which I also did in the last slide. It's not to the benevolence of the brewer, the baker, the butcher that we owe our daily bread, etc. But that was only a part of Smith. Smith was trying to emphasize the idea that markets are free markets, right? Free markets, liberty is an important instrument towards in the process of creating an ideal society. Right? It is a part of his liberal plan. It is not, it is not the single most important guiding principle in Smith. Okay, right? So in the next few classes now, we'll understand basically the intellectual origins of Smith's ideas, what kind of policy structure Smith comes about, how does he think of institutions, why are institutions important for Smith, what is the role of government, how does one understand government, how does one see how does one resolve the tension between private interest and public interest, and all that is there in Smith. Unfortunately, I think we have not explored Smith as a writer. Uh, Probably because Smith is very polemical. Smith digresses a lot. Smith's book is very big. At points, there are many long pages which seem to be completely irrelevant. It is contradictory, paradoxical. It's difficult to read Smith. It's difficult to read The Wealth of Nations. It's even more difficult to read Wealth of Nations, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, The History of Astronomy together. In addition to that, there was actually a large treatise on government what Smith was trying to write when he died. And as all of you know, Smith actually had all his papers destroyed when he died. Right? So he asked the executors of his estate to burn all his papers. But some things have come through and notes taken for Dwight Stewart, who wrote a book on Smith. Right? So we have to recover Smith. We have to recover Smith. I will, as I go on, will also talk to you about how Smith has actually been appropriated by the Chicago tradition. The Chicago tradition that we have of essentially utilitarian markets, right, where markets are everything. Self-interest is everything. Government control is necessarily pernicious, right? I think those kinds of arguments are misconstrued. Okay, and we'll also look at the line followed by people like Sen and people like Buchanan and try to see how we can actually make sense of Smith. Yeah? So I think we'll have to stop a little early today because I have to go somewhere. But you can send me the questions on email on this. I actually shared the PowerPoint with you, right? But at the moment, I just want you to carry over the feeling that Smith is important, and the Adam Smith that is actually exists is quite different from the kind of caricature that we get of Smith, right? So with that, I think we'll stop right now, and I will see you next Sunday, right? Unless you have some questions right now. Yeah, do you all have any questions right now?
I don't think so, sir. I don't think anybody has any questions at the
Sure.
moment.
So please tell me. Thank you.
Sir, hello.
Yes, Anupam, bolo.
Sir, I'm Shubham.
Yes, Shubham, bolo.
Sir, according to Smith, he has laid some functions of the government, right? There are three functions of the government, and according to him, uh, means if we think from the point of view of the same functions that he laid, and today's governance, what can be means the privatization and everything? Is it going to be? Are you getting my
So,
point?
for example, yeah, I'm getting your point. So, for example, something which leads to rise in inequality
Yes.
will not be according to Smith, right? So for example, it's not really correct to say that Smith had specific functions of the government which said that government should only maintain law and order and only supply public goods. That is clearly not there in Smith. There is inequality in society, then governments will actually step in to correct that inequality because that deters from Smith's idea of what is an ideal life.
Okay.
Yeah. So Smith is much more than the kind of literary economics that we have learned. I think at some extent the kind of economics you have learned is what it is convenient to some people, right? But we will, yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.